Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. The academic semester is finally waning down, and the American primaries are heating up, with Ron DeSantis rumored to be entering the race this week. So I thought it would be a great time to take a step back and survey the political tech landscape. And this episode is going to be all about the political tech landscape on the left with my guest, Russell Mindich. He is a political consultant and one of the authors of the 2022 Political Tech Landscape Report put out by Higher Ground Labs. Higher Ground Labs, we've talked about them on the show before. They are a venture fund that invests in startups working in the progressive political tech space. So every year they put out a political tech landscape report. I definitely encourage y'all to check it out. There'll be a link in the episode description because it covers a number of emerging trends across various aspects of political campaigning. So things like messaging and media, which is mostly what we'll talk about in this episode, but also things like data analytics, fundraising, voter contact, activist mobilization. And the report has this really nice map that has all the logos of the different companies in this progressive tech landscape. And it's huge. It's a huge map. And social media does not take up so much in the map. And we'll talk about that with Russell in terms of what he and the other contributors of the report think are the major emerging trends, particularly when it comes to social media. So we'll talk about things like the move over to streaming services like Hulu, Disney Plus, Apple TV, etc. We'll talk about influencers and how companies are formalizing the process of connecting political campaigns to influencers, and interestingly, how influencers can be used to get around political advertising restrictions. We'll also talk about generative AI and see what Russell thinks are the potential use cases for this technology when it comes to political campaigns. And so all in all, I think it's a great episode to kind of take a step back and see where are we when it comes to political tech here in 2023 as the American elections for 2024 start getting underway proper. So without further ado, let me turn it over to my guest, Russell Mindich. Again, he is a political consultant and a lead author of the Political Tech Landscape Report by Higher Ground Labs. Russell, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before we dive into the report itself, could you start out by giving us a brief introduction to Higher Ground Labs? What type of work does the fund support and how might it differ from similar initiatives on the right?
Totally. Well, Higher Ground Labs is a venture fund and accelerator specifically reserved for democratic political technology companies. It was founded in 2017 by Betsy Hoover and Shomik Dutta. And since then, the fund has deployed over $50 million invested in more than 60 startups. Its work is premised on the idea that each cycle, pre-2016, campaigns would typically build up an in-house tech stack, dedicating significant resources in the process, and then wind it down or discard it once the election is over. By cultivating an ecosystem of for-profit startups exclusively reserved for the left, with the proper incentives to sort of stick around for the long term, we can save campaigns time and money while also optimizing their traditional functions. Higher Ground's most well-known work is its accelerator, where every year between 8 and 12 companies engage in a months-long program focused on bolstering their product, their sales and marketing approach, their fundraising prospects, client identification, and hiring practices. Higher Ground Labs also conducts year-round research on developments across the political tech space, which culminates in its annual landscape report that I'm excited to discuss today.
Definitely. And the report we'll be discussing has this really cool visual of the kind of map of the progressive tech landscape. And it categorizes certain groups of companies by their function, whether that's messaging, analytics, or organizing. And my first question is, what's the idea behind producing such a report? Because I heard some political operatives on the right talking on a podcast that this was basically the left like publishing their playbook and sort of showing their cards. I mean, do you think that's a bit of an overstatement? And what's the idea behind putting out this information and making it public?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, the landscape report is designed to serve as a resource for Democratic campaigns, advocacy orgs, practitioners, entrepreneurs, and investors. It catalogs new entrants into the market, summarizes notable trends on both on the left and the right, and calls out areas in need of further innovation. It's really a mechanism for institutionalizing the insights that would otherwise get lost in translation at the end of each cycle. I'd say it's hardly the left's playbook. None of the information presented in the report is a secret. And if Republican operatives weren't aware of the trends and uses of technology found throughout, then I'd say they're not doing their jobs particularly well. The benefit of taking stock of the status of democratic tech, suggesting optimal pathways towards further innovation, and providing campaigns and entrepreneurs alike with up-to-date valuable information outweighs the downside of the unlikely scenario in which we're teaching the right something they don't already know.
Definitely. And I think that gets also to something we'll probably talk about a bit later, which is this maybe difference in capacities, skills, and resources between top of ticket and down ballot campaigns. So it seems like this would really help down ballot campaigns get a sense of what's available to them as they kick off their 2024 races.
Definitely.
So I want to stick to messaging and media because that's kind of where social media is. And just kind of looking at the report, the amount of space given to social media platforms is maybe like 5% of this overall visualization mapping out all these different companies. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on social media's current role in the campaign apparatus. Is it sort of waning in importance overall, or do you think it varies by the type of campaign?
I'd say, first off, social media is definitely not waning in importance across the political space. But I see how the landscape map might give you and others that impression, since it largely covers startups, new third-party apps, and pieces of infrastructure that help Democratic campaigns and organizations do their jobs better. But many of these companies directly integrate with social media platforms, since that's where Americans are really spending their time. And social media platforms broadly are certainly still relevant battlegrounds for fundraising, persuasion, and mobilization. Campaigns can rightly continue to utilize meta platforms, Twitter, and TikTok for these purposes. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. I do think uses of social media largely do vary based on the type of campaign, meaning a presidential would invest much more heavily in digital ads for fundraising and persuasion than down ballot campaigns who might, try to cultivate more organic conversations and groups on these platforms due to their smaller budgets. But overall, I think social media is still one of, if not the primary digital battleground for political campaigning.
Definitely. And I want to get into some of the trends that you outline in the report. But maybe before we get there, I mean, do you think there's something to social media? I know you mentioned in the report these newer platforms like Be Real and obviously TikTok. I mean, is there something to the kind of traditional Democratic voter profile of appealing to younger voters or youth voters and how they're sort of fractured across all these upstart platforms? I mean, does that make a different dynamic for social media and campaigning relative to conservatives who tend to be older?
I think so. I also think, as a general observation, the social media landscape is in a period of sort of rapid transition. The rise of TikTok and the uncertainty of its future, given efforts on the part of federal legislators to ban or diminish its scope within the United States, Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter and subsequent platform changes. I think, we're definitely in a period of transition, especially when you consider on the right the fact that, in addition to Elon Musk, there have been attempts to sort of create new platforms such as Rumble and Trump's Truth Social. I think more generally, you're right to observe that Democrats sort of have a trickier take on this ecosystem, given the fact that trying to target, the Gen Z and, younger voter population is sort of much more scattered and very much so not on Facebook, which is sort of the easiest and kind of prime marketplace for political advertising. I think Be Real has, largely been used last cycle as a gimmick. I also read recently that Be Real has lost a good chunk of its users. It seems to me a bit more as a fad than some longer term piece of infrastructure useful for the left's organizing operation. But TikTok much more so, though they don't allow political ads, is very much a battleground where campaign organizers and practitioners are very much so trying to reach the youngest generation.
Definitely. And I want to get to influencers, everybody's favorite topic, in just a second. But I also want to ask you, you mentioned Truth Social and Rumble. I mean, and of course, there's sort of the Trump profile that, creating his own brand of social media, and we'll see how that works out. But I just wonder from the left, and I've heard that Higher Ground Labs is, very well resourced. Has there been any sort of discussion about creating a sort of left-wing political social media platform in response to those sort of right-wing initiatives?
There hasn't, at least not conversations that I've been a part of. And I think that's less so a question of resources, though, of course, it would take sort of a gargantuan effort to spin something like that up and to cultivate audience, but more so the fact that, as of now, the market is largely being served across meta platforms, TikTok and Twitter. Young Americans on the left and on the right sort of have a home for their social and political discourse. But say, for example, in 18 months' time, Twitter takes a turn, which is conceivable based on recent trends, and TikTok is no longer allowed in the US. I could see an opening for a new platform, though don't think there have been many developments there to date.
Yeah. Maybe we'll see Sanders Sandbox. Who knows? Let's jump into to influencers. I thought this was really interesting in the report. Basically, you argue that going into 2024, influencers is seen more as becoming more formalized in a sort of institutionalized mode of campaigning. And there's a couple companies that also are working to help kind of streamline campaigns, partnerships with influencers. So can you tell us a bit about those initiatives going on in the influencer marketing space?
Absolutely. And I'd say as a top line, influencers, which in the 2018 cycle was really just sort of an informal idea where people started to realize based on the trends of relational organizing that the messenger matters just as much, if not more, than the message. So I've been encouraged to see new startups pop up and sort of more institutional adoption of this practice, especially on the part of the 2020 Biden presidential campaign in the DNC. Two initiatives are top of mind for me. One is called Vocal Media and the other People First, both relatively newer startups, People First being founded a bit earlier than Vocal Media. Vocal is explicitly dedicated to the idea of connecting influencers with campaigns and organizations. They help their partners, campaigns and advocacy orgs develop messages, define their audience, and plot out engagement strategies. Then they actually do the hard part. They recruit influencers and deploy them to social media platforms with broad guidelines on the type of content they want to espouse to produce and promote compelling content. People First has a similar approach, though they're branded as more of sort of a micro-influencer organization, where they're able to kind of identify these people and compensate them at scale to support worthy causes. An example where I know they experienced some recent success was working with Planned Parenthood on a TikTok-focused Gen Z targeted influencer campaign surrounding sexual health.
And, I'm curious because Higher Ground Labs is in the venture capital space. I mean, what's the business model behind these type of matchmakers between influencers and political campaigns?
Yeah, I will say generally, business models across the political tech space vary greatly and are starkly different than what we'd see in sort of like the traditional commercial startup space. Across these companies, their business models are largely surround sort of almost consulting fees to sort of use this service. While campaigns will also sort of have to pay for compensation of influencers. I'd say, their value proposition is around their ability to identify and engage these sort of micro influencers, high follower count individuals on platforms of choice at scale.
Yeah, and I think one of the really interesting things about the report for me that I hadn't really thought about was the idea of influencers basically getting around political advertising bans, right? So TikTok doesn't allow for political advertising, but if you can partner with an influencer, you essentially can carry your message to the platform, a political message without formally calling it political advertising. And so I wonder, when it comes to influencers, at least in the academic world, we talk a lot about, how they foster trust and how they create these parasocial relationships. And I wonder, that's definitely part of it, but is the utility of influencers for campaigns something much more concrete, like getting around political advertising restrictions or being able to target a specific voter block effectively?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. As you mentioned, TikTok is the prime example here. It's a primary social media home for Gen Z and one that doesn't allow targeted or really any political advertising. I'd say organic influencer-driven content on TikTok is not only an easier way to reach Gen Z and younger Americans more generally, given the platform's ban on political ads, it's also a more effective medium. Younger Americans respond better to less salesy, official-looking advertisements, as you'd see sort of on Facebook targeted to the older demographic. They much prefer to hear from voices they resonate with on the platforms that they frequent. It's not a catch-all, and more concrete data is definitely needed here to prove that theory of the case, but early trials have been encouraging. So yes, influencer marketing on TikTok is useful since there's really no other alternative, and that's where young Americans spend a lot of their time, but we've also found through these early trials that it's a more effective way to reach them.
Definitely. And how then do you go about measuring that success? So let's take a platform like Instagram, for example, where if you run an ad, you can see, number of impressions, number of click-throughs, things like that. I'd imagine it's harder to report for an influencer what the effect is, unless the influencer can give you some stats from their channel, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it would have to be, well, it's definitely based on the data that each platform, allows for. It's very different across TikTok and Meta platforms. I'd encourage you and your listeners to check out some recent influencer-related studies from the Analyst Institute, which have sort of found novel ways to test sort of more abstract effect sizes like this. In general, I'm a fan of the Analyst Institute and all they do in the experiments they run to sort of add more data behind claims surrounding political tactics and organizing.
Very cool. I'll check it out, put a link in the episode description so y'all can check it out. And pivoting a bit off influencer partnerships, I mean, I think the fact that campaigns are thinking about reaching out to these sort of micro influencers signals some level of dissatisfaction with current modes of digital advertising, which is something that the report picks up as well. And in particular, you write that campaigns are hungry for more effective alternatives than Facebook. So, what are some of the issues that campaigns are hitting with Facebook? And even with these problems, isn't Facebook still the best social for fundraising just by virtue of the fact that older and wealthier people are active there?
Yeah. Facebook is definitely still highly useful for fundraising amongst the audience that still uses the platform. And you're right to say that's older folks with more disposable income and more experience donating to political campaigns and causes. But the problems with Facebook surround recent policy changes related to targeting and transparency requirements, and its stagnant user base. Most importantly, money spent on Facebook ads today doesn't offer the same ROI as it did throughout the 2018 cycle, when the demographic makeup of its users and its sort of targeting capabilities on the part of advertisers were starkly different. At the same time, TikTok, Twitter and Twitch, YouTube all have sort of different takes on sort of what they allow in terms of political advertising. Snapchat and Reddit have typically been on the back burner. So Facebook really is the primary home for this. Like we were talking about earlier, I expect this to evolve over the next 5 years. But the fact that Facebook has sort of made it harder for advertisers to target based on demonstrated interest on the part of users on the platform definitely makes it less compelling, though it's really the only game in town. So political advertisers are still forced to go there.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's the only game in town, but as you mentioned before, the social media landscape is in this kind of, rapid fracturing development. So many platforms are on the rise and fall. I mean, is maybe that Facebook's main sort of value proposition, that it's somewhat stable?
Yeah, I definitely think so. At the same time, Facebook has been criticized for sort of its early role in promoting misinformation and sort of creating the original partisan echo chambers, which have led to a lot of really relevant and I think accurate criticisms of the role of social media, across the political space. But at the same time, so long as people are still on the platform, it's still going to be used for advertising.
Definitely. So let's move over to the, at least in the way that it's presented in the report, the kind of top line big move when it comes to media and messaging, and that is the move towards streaming platforms. And we've talked about this on the show before, that they're sort of valuable and that a lot of older people are cutting the cord, and you're able, if you have enough resources, to buy a non-skippable ad, which is quite nice. You get the forced exposure to sound, for example, that maybe not is on a mobile phone. So this creates a lot of challenges for campaigns in competing with commercial brands for advertising. Can you talk a little bit about this move towards streaming and what it might mean for the 2024 cycle?
Yeah. Well, the transition to streaming service ads was really sharp and sudden. Last cycle, ad spending here increased 15 times with respect to 2020. And that's largely due to policy changes on the part of popular platforms that now allow political content. Hulu, Paramount Plus, and Peacock loom large there. As we approached Election Day in 2022, the price of these ads really spiked as campaigns competed to secure limited spots in an auction-based pricing system. It's quite interesting to think not only did campaigns end up spending more money for these ads, but given their limited budgets, really made the choice to spend there as opposed to traditional TV. This is much more of a factor for congressional campaigns with smaller budgets as opposed to presidential and Senate campaigns that benefit from significantly large independent expenditures that can take out these ads with little downside. The key factors to watch here moving forward are rising prices and the affordability of these ads among smaller campaigns with an eye towards down ballot and congressional, and further policy changes on additional platforms, looking at Disney Plus in particular. The emergence of new technologies to help track reach and impact here is definitely important. I haven't seen all that much of it as of last cycle. I think there's definitely more to come there. But for the most part, I think streaming service ads is definitely a new battleground for political campaigns, with affordability looming large as kind of a key factor in determining who can afford them.
And it seems like from reading the report, I mean, one of the ways that Higher Ground Labs can help is to, example, invest in funds that sort of streamline this process? I'm not sure it relates so much to the content creation side, but more to the ad buying side. So I'm just curious to hear like what type of tech solutions can help, progressive campaigns or other campaigns effectively use their budgets to tap into these streaming platforms.
Yeah. Well, generally, I think that a lot of the innovation we'd be seeing in ad buying falls a bit out of Higher Ground Labs' scope. They're largely investing in startups that help optimize traditional functions, and a lot of this ad buying work typically happens within consulting firms. It's very much consultant driven, so not something that Higher Ground Labs has prioritized in the past in terms of novel third party application solutions. But I think more generally, in terms of how campaigns are using their budgets, I'd point you all towards one particular Higher Ground Labs company called War Chest, which is a budget optimizer and tracker for campaigns. So as you think about like changing prices, you're able to toggle inputs. It's a very easy way to sort of visualize the money you have raised and kind of where you'd be able to spend it based on current prices.
Yeah, it reminds me actually of a conversation we had on the podcast maybe a couple of years ago, and someone was saying that like the kind of stuff that campaigns need is like a QuickBooks for politics. It's not like a super snazzy, AI content generator. It's more of like reporting and these sort of basic fundamentals of budgeting and spending that technology can help streamline.
Totally.
Well, speaking of buzz around generative AI, the report also mentions this, and obviously it's, we don't really know what's happening or what the long-term effects of this are for political campaigning. But what do you think about these sort of large language models, ChatGPT, AutoGPT, whatever is the current one when listeners are listening? Will they offer campaigns a significant efficiency boost in your view? Or is their output kind of too generic to really tap into voters' passions?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. I'm a huge believer in the power of generative AI to help campaign staff optimize traditional functions. I view these tools as an enhancer for Democratic campaigns' most valuable assets, their people, their talent. Human editing and supervision will almost surely always be required, but generative AI has the power to take a pretty good first cut at drafting fundraising emails, digital ads, peer-to-peer texts, and more. Outputs that I've seen thus far are pretty close to par. They're generic, yeah, but nothing that 60 seconds of human labor can't spice up. And this is going to be a huge boon for efficiency this cycle and beyond. The challenge is using these tools productively. It's kind of incumbent on technologists and practitioners to design programs that channel the power of generative AI while mitigating the risk to the integrity of campaign products.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, one question I was thinking about is, okay, on the one hand, you could ask one of these programs to give you a generic fundraising email, but then you could also ask it to give you 1 million fundraising emails and then just optimize and A/B test which one would be the best. So I wonder, do you think that that's sort of on the horizon? Like, are we just going to see just massive amounts of A/B testing because of the ability to scale up content generation?
I think so. It's sort of it's really a revolution across the space. The ability to test so many outputs at a very low cost. And I think the same logic also applies to drafting polling instruments, which is another task that requires human input but can be sufficiently drafted by AI. I think there's still a lot more development to happen here. I don't have any sort of recent developments to call out, but I would like to mention two organizations that have done this well and who I expect to innovate in this space: Blue Rose Research and Grow Progress. Last cycle, they piloted novel methods for sourcing survey participants and analyzing results at a remarkably low cost. So I look forward to seeing how these established, well-funded players in this space incorporate AI over the long term. And I totally expect some experiments, to that end to occur before 2024.
And what kind of sort of novel methods of surveys and polling do you mean? Is it tapping into underrepresented groups or just untraditional ways of contacting them? Or kind of what's the idea there?
More so, very regimented live digital panel surveys that they've been able to sort of cultivate at lower cost. I think the major innovation there, in addition to sourcing participants in speed, is the fact that you can now do a simple message test for under $400, which a couple years ago, when most of this was largely consultant driven, it might have been 2 or 3 times or even more than that.
Interesting. So then it's obviously more easy to pass down to down ballot campaigns as well.
Yes, though down ballot campaigns can't really afford a $400 message test, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah, but I mean, it definitely depends on the campaign. I'd say the average state legislative campaign in the U.S. is not doing any message testing.
Interesting. Huh. Well, we've been talking a lot about social media, and listeners can check out the report to read all about canvassing, deep canvassing, all that stuff. But I'm curious about, where Higher Ground Labs is particularly focused ahead of 2024. I mean, you mentioned technologies or companies like War Chest that are looking more at the sort of budget dashboard kind of side as I interpret it. I mean, where is the money investment, the startup, the sort of entrepreneurship needed when it comes to progressive political tech?
Yeah. Well, there are a bunch of areas across the political tech ecosystem that I think require urgent investment. We've already talked about two of them. AI, which really, really stands tall here. The faster that Democrats are able to figure out how to harness its power for the sake of efficiency and scalability, the stronger advantage they'll have at the ballot box. The areas that I'm most interested in, aside from the ones that we've already talked about, are drafting, fundraising emails and polling instruments, conducting research, both opposition research and sort of general campaign tasks that would otherwise take interns hours, compiling press clippings and media mentions and so much more. There are a bunch of entrepreneurs that I've spoken to who I know are very interested in building solutions here, both nonprofit, open source, and for-profit. And I look forward to seeing how that develops before the next election. Moving beyond AI, down ballot campaigns really still suffer from an insufficient tech stack. They have smaller budgets and different scopes. The districts and their total voter universe size is much smaller, but they really need tech solutions that work for them. Believe it or not, most of them are still using Google Sheets and other sort of rudimentary programs to organize their campaign activities, while campaigns even one rung above, at the congressional level, have sort of far more sophisticated platforms. There have been some recent attempts here, but much more work is needed across this subset of the ecosystem. More generally, I think campaigns need some more regimented technology solutions surrounding donor tracking and compliance. And as it relates to influencers, the platforms that I called out earlier have made massive strides in connecting campaigns to people on the ground who are posting relevant content. But I think we need a bit more work there in terms of making it a bit more scalable and affordable, and also tracking its impact, as we discussed earlier.
Definitely. And, as the 2024 primaries start heating up already, I thought it was a great chance to look at the political tech landscape, see where we're at, and see how this tech develops over the presidential cycle and beyond. So, Russell, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
I've just been speaking with Russell Mindich, a political consultant and one of the authors of the Political Tech Landscape Report by Higher Ground Labs. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I know the past few episodes have been U.S. focused with the election kicking off, but we try to find some scholars working on other contexts in the coming weeks. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmo. See you next time.